Welcome to Uncomfortable, conversations about culture and Christianity. My name is Eric, and today I'm joined by Rachel.
Hey, y'all.
And Jess.
Hello, world.
And Alex.
Back again.
Yes, indeed. We're back in the studio as well.
Yeah.
We're not coming at you remotely, but it's a new year. The calendar page turned. Everything is all good now. Everything is better.
We're fine. We're doing great.
It's December 32nd,
Happy
2020.
New Year.
Yeah, no, I hopefully things, are going to get better. But it's
You sounded confident.
I'm very confident.
Well, as we record this, it's a little wild.
Yeah, I guess we should just mention it now because it's not going to be a headline that we can really cover, even though this episode releases on Friday. We are watching what's happening at the Capitol building in the US of A right now. A lot of craziness. That's all. I mean, we don't have a lot to say. We don't know a lot other than that people are storming the Capitol building, and there were protesters on the Senate floor, which hasn't happened for many, many years in this country. But here we are.
Yeah, and I think offering our prayers. Before this, prayed for that situation because we don't know what's going to happen, but there are a lot of important things and buildings and all of that happening there. So it's not just a cavalier, we don't know what's happening, but and it's easy to say thoughts and prayers, but sincerely, I think.
Well, and I think at this point, whatever we would discuss around it would be so out of date by the time this episode airs on Friday that we don't have a lot to say. We don't know. Hopefully things just calm down. But speaking of 2021, did anyone have any New Year's resolutions or this thing I just became privy to when we were in a meeting about this podcast for this week is the one word for the year. And Jess said she did this and Rachel says she does this. And I felt left out because I haven't picked a word. So maybe you guys can help me pick my one.
I don't have a word, but I had heard
one.
of it. So I was one step ahead of you.
Okay.
But not as far as
you haven't picked out your word for the year.
I have not yet.
Okay. Well,
nor have I ever.
I really want to get into that. So, Jess, what's your word for the year? Are you able to share, or is it too personal?
No, I can share.
It's not like gingivitis.
Please, Lord, no gingivitis. No, it can only be one word. So this is the fourth year that I've done it. And this year I asked my whole family to do it, and I put it up on a little board outside our door. But my word for this year is balance. Mm-hmm. I feel like I've kind of started a lot of different projects in 2020, and 2020 was hard as it was, and just wanting to be centered and find a balance of what I'm going to say yes to, what I'm going to say no to, and just being centered around that. Mm-hmm.
Now, I know you have been watching Cobra Kai because we taltaled about this.
Is that why
the word balance was inspired?
Yes. I may start karate too.
Okay, good.
That might be my New Year's resolution. I don't know. But balance was mine. How about you, Rachel?
Okay, so might be a little weird. It's shalom. So I kind of was thinking content, being content with things that I, have, and just thankful and just living in what God's given me. But I felt like shalom really encompassed it a little bit better, and just how I just want to have more contentness and just being with God and peace in my relationship with Him and just my life. So that is my word this year. It's kind of different than normal because I normally just pick I like it single something, but yeah. So I'm excited about that.
So this one word thing, where did this originate? I'm going to guess Instagram.
MySpace.
TikTok.
Yeah.
No, for me, this is my fourth year doing this. And so it kind of, for me, came out of a time that was really difficult. I found out that I was pregnant, and the next day my husband got laid off from his job. And that kind of went into this year-long, really hard thing that we went through together, and in our marriage and financially. And so I struggled with some anxiety and depression, and I had a baby. And just for me, I really feel like I pivoted in my relationship of just refocusing on the Lord. And I also found CrossFit that year, and it all kind of fit into this okay, God's taking me to a new place, but what is just one thing that I can focus on? Because there was so much turmoil happening for me personally. So if it's like, if I had one thing to like hold on to, then I could do it. And so my word for my first year was flourish, because I just wanted to like kind of come out of this and like let God grow and change me. And so then it kind of has just like carried on from there for me. And so so this year then when I chose my word, and I like order a bracelet and it has like my word on it, just to like help me focus through the year. So I do it with a couple friends, and then this year we had our boys choose words too, which they
I can only guess.
theirs was
Poop.
fun and play. Put your clothes,
Duty.
Alex, like poop and pee. It was close, but I just like took the first good word they said. So that's for me.
Yeah. I can't remember, honestly. I know it's just like, I feel like it's a common like Christian like woman thing that goes around. But last year I did Abide, which was really cool. I think it's a cool thing to kind of come back to throughout the year. And like, it's kind of cool because you give that word to God and like allow him to kind of work in ways. Like there were so many times when I was like, oh my gosh, I'm so glad that's my word. Like God specifically, I feel like chose that word for me throughout the year. I almost got a tattoo because of it. And so it's just like really cool to see how God's faithful and works through whatever word you choose for the year. And
Okay, real quick then, Jess, why don't you pick a word for Alex? And then I think I'll have Rachel pick a word for me so we can get into this. So we're prepared for this year to move forward into 2021. We put you on the spot.
Be kind.
Yeah. But you want to think about it, and we'll circle back right before headlines.
Sure.
Okay. So think about our words.
yeah, sounds good.
And then let's talk a little bit about resolutions. This isn't a practice I normally partake in. I mean, I feel like for me, New Year's resolutions are just a way for me to set myself up for failure, and I don't really like to do it because I'm like, I'm going to do this year. And then even the years that I've tried my hardest and failed, it's like, that wasn't fun. So I don't know. I don't really get into that too much anymore, but maybe I think it does feel, it's very symbolic, and it's just a new year, whatever. But it feels like the page turning. It feels like the right time to take on something new.
Mm-hmm.
For me, it's more of like a reset every year. And I think it's just the timing that is nice of it, because I try most of, the day throughout the year. Like I've talked about, like over a year ago, I did one meal a day, and I've been doing that. And so I try to like do healthy eating most of the time, but then it gives me permission, like knowing, okay, new year, I'm going to start, at least jump back on that train. But for 3 weeks, like my birthday's in there, Christmas is in there, a lot of family celebrations.
It's just Alex at the buffet line.
It's just like 3 weeks. No guilty conscience for 3 weeks. Yeah. It feels like when I had really bad theology as a teenager, and like I would say, God forgive me of this before I go do it, so like I'd be like, all right, I'm gonna like go play this game my mom told me not to play, and I know it's wrong, so God, will you forgive me that in 10 minutes so it's kind of like that. It's just a reset for me to like recalibrate and pick a day. Because it's always Monday, like anytime someone starts something, it's always, next week. Yeah. So it's always for me like a day to start new habits, I think. And so, but not like, I'm not a huge resolution. I'm a revolutionary, but not a resolution.
You'd be in DC right now if that was the case.
Thank you.
I mean, does this word kind of, it's kind of symbolic of your resolution in a way for you?
I think
Rachel
it's kind of separate. I feel like
separate?
that's more of a maybe spiritual, not goal, but just like, like redirecting or whatever. I am reading To Hell with the Hustle by Jefferson Bethke. I'm a big fan of him. So I am reading his book, and he talks about how they don't even set goals anymore, because they just talk about how habits actually form you more than just like a long term this is where I want to be. And so I think that's really helpful, just to be like, it can't just be like a end goal, like I want this, and once I get there I'm going to be like good to go, but it's more of I need to form this habit because that's actually going to make me better in the long run. And so trying to maybe form better habits at the beginning of the year and stick with it throughout the rest of the year.
I think for me, the word, and I do this with my Christian friends and non-Christian friends, it's a word that's kind of like a gatekeeper to decisions that you make or things that you want to accomplish. So for me, it's like, I want to get better, like in the gym doing a certain lift. It's like, okay, what do I need to get there? Like, how do I balance the rest of my life to like accomplish that?
That's good.
And if it fits, it fits. If it doesn't, then
Yeah.
like it
Like a
makes
filter for
it makes
you.
yeses and nos easier, and it makes boundaries to me easier to set and easier to maintain. So I've already like said no to a couple things, like just having that focus. So
That's really good.
I actually think I have Alex's word.
Okay, well, hold on to that thought.
Okay.
And I think I
got
have
it.
Eric's work too.
Okay,
so.
well, fine. Let's just do it. Do it right now.
We're going for
Go
it.
ahead.
I just like said a little prayer. I know that maybe sounds
I did too.
cheesy.
I was like, I need to pray because it's
I said a little prayer, and I'm going to try not to get emotional
Okay, Alex's word.
because I do care about Alex.
My word.
Even though
You
he
shouldn't.
drives me up and down the wall, not just up it.
Yeah.
And so I was just like, Holy Spirit, like, what is his word?
Swimming pool.
Oh man. Okay. I don't
two.
know. I feel like I'm like some
Okay,
psychic.
And he
What
can
is-
receive
What's
it
his
or
word?
yeah.
Let me hear. Okay. Alex, your word is peace. I feel like you had quite a few things happen in 2020 and recently, and I think it's maybe a cheesy like love, joy, peace, but I feel like peace, like I'm praying for you, and I picked the word, so I'm gonna pray for you for this. But I pray that the Lord shows you what that means when it says like peace that passes all understanding, that he really proves to you in your job, in your life, like that he just is reinforcing that, and like that your relationship is closer with the Lord because of that. So
Wow.
I will accept the prayers. I will think about the word, accepting the word for my whole year. But that is good. That
Well,
is good. I appreciate
wow.
that.
You're
That is-
welcome.
thank
Wow.
you.
Okay. Tough to follow, but
Please be Doritos.
please be the Taco Bell Dorito.
I was like trying to pray about it too and just think about, trust popped into my mind because I feel like I sense that, Eric, you take a lot of weight on your shoulders for other people, and how that, like, a lot of your family members and friends, and how they are, like, what they believe or what they're following, and like you take that weight on your shoulders. And I think maybe it's hard for you to let God kind of handle situations because you want to like help everyone, and that's such a cool characteristic. But I think maybe trust and like trusting
Yeah.
God that he's gonna like hold things and take care of them
That'd be
even
good.
when you feel out of control. So
I, unlike Alex, will totally accept that.
oh, thank
and
you.
I'll just fully accept it right now and not have to say I'll think about it or
okay,
anything.
good.
No,
you're
just
not going to pray about
Yeah,
it. Either.
no, just,
I accept the word. I just don't know that I'm accepting the tradition.
I'm just messing with you.
that's
I'm
fine.
just teasing.
It sounds like I got to buy a bracelet, a T-shirt, like all that. And I'm not.
And now you're and
Just
now
put it on your hat.
don't
She
downplay
talked about
it.
getting a
A tattoo,
tattoo,
yeah.
you know. So
We're gonna come back with tattoos.
some of that I have to
next.
talk to my wife about, you know.
Trust
Oh
on
my
my
goodness.
on my shoulder.
Big old bumper sticker.
Oh,
Okay, we
gosh.
really got to move on.
Okay.
But one quick thing we wanted to do, we thought it would be fun. We are having a guest on today. Josh Dotzler is joining us, or at least Alex, later on.
From
And-
Rachel's 2020 word,
yeah,
abide.
Yeah.
But we thought since it's a new year, we should probably have some new questions to ask our guests.
Yes.
And we thought it would be fun for our listeners to pick those 3 questions. So, you know the drill. At CCC Omaha on social media, send us a message on Instagram or Twitter or Facebook and say, these are the 3 questions you should ask your guests. And we'll probably pick some amalgamation of what everyone sends in. So
Make them good. Make them good.
Make them very good.
Can't wait.
All right, everyone. Up next, headlines. Headlines. Our first headline of the day is from Vulture, which I was about to read this headline, and then Alex informed me of whoever wrote this headline kind of did it wrong. I'll
Devin.
read the
Looks like Devin.
Devin messed up here. I'm going to read the headline like it is written, which says, "A deaf woman is Matt James' current Bachelor frontrunner." And you, go ahead and explain.
Yeah. Well, actually, my wife reminded me of this, but and we obviously have, and if you don't know this, a deaf child, and so you wouldn't say it a deaf child. You would actually say we have a child who is deaf, you know, and so how this is written is a deaf woman. So if you're talking about any kind of disability or something someone has, you always put person first. And so this headline should read, a woman that is deaf is Matt James' current Bachelor frontrunner. So hopefully there was a little bit of an education. I didn't know that.
I learned something.
I didn't know that until we had a child who is deaf. Like I would have just, you know, said it. And so it's one of those taboo, culturally sensitive things.
And because I'm learning to trust this year, thanks to Rachel, I'm not even going to look it up to validate what you just told me.
Thank you.
Like I normally would. I will just believe and trust that you're telling me the truth.
Created a monster.
Yes.
No, anyways, Alex, you picked this headline because it kind of hits close to home, and also shouts out to Mackenzie, who was a former podcast.
That's all we remember her by is The Bachelor.
The Bachelor.
Well, she wanted us to talk about it like one time when she was on here. And I think this is maybe the second time since she's been gone. Sorry, that was Kelly Clarkson.
So I'm going to let you kind of explain this and kind of what it means to you.
Yeah, I'm not a huge Bachelor person, so this is not necessarily...
You are married, yes.
This is not necessarily a... Anyway.
That's letting everybody know.
Yes.
Alex is married.
Alex is not a bachelor.
I will not be on this show. But for the first time ever, they had a woman who is deaf on the show, and she has cochlear implants. And so I wasn't watching it, but then I was doing some work at home the other day, and my wife's like, "You're going to love this. You have to see this." And so first it was because the guy came in, the bachelor named Matt came in, and he prayed, you know, first thing he did. "I'd love to meet you girls, but first I'm going to pray." Which there's feels about that. But anyway, shout out to him for doing that. But then on The Bachelor, you know, you meet all of these women, or if you're on The Bachelorette, the opposite, but meet all of them. And after the first night of just meeting them, you give a safety rose, a first impression rose. And he gave it to this girl named Abigail. And so for me, as a dad who has a daughter who is deaf and has cochlear implants, and just thinking about her future, and there's a lot of fear involved in what's that going to look like, how are people going to make fun of her, and you don't hear about this kind of stuff a lot. So for me, like even her showing me that clip was this moment of like hope and not really rejoicing, because it's The Bachelor, so it's a fleeting thing, but it was also this thing where it's a headline, it's in the forefront of people, and for me it was like, oh, okay, this could happen, you know. She's not going to be on The Bachelor. That is not going to happen. I will not allow that.
Dreams coming true.
But she can be looked at as quote unquote normal, and you know, and even have, there's 30, I don't know how many women on there, but out of all of them, she's the one that like had that best first impression. And so for me, it was just a hopeful moment of seeing that. And then like the Google search went way up on that, and people a lot of times don't know what cochlear implants are, because like literally someone that has that is typically deaf, like they cannot hear. So it's different than hearing aids and all that kind of stuff. Go Google it, because it's trending right now, if you want more information about what that looks like. But for me as a dad, it was kind of like a really cool moment. So
that is really cool. All right, our next headline comes from Omaha.com. This is obviously a local story. It says Omaha saw a 61% spike in homicides in 2020 after the lows of the last 2 years, which I know that was something that we, even as a church, celebrated in the last 2 years, is look at the homicide rates. And not that we were taking credit, but it was just, we've been involved in a lot of ministry in North Omaha, and so it's been good to see some of the positive effects of that. Yeah. But now we're starting to see the spike this year, which I'm sure is caused by a lot of things, not just the pandemic, but racial tension and other things like that.
Yeah, this is crazy. And we talk a little bit about it later. Or Alex, you guys talk about it, and I think it's really interesting.
Alex and Josh.
Yeah. I really think it's interesting the outlook that Josh takes on it, because I moved downtown recently, and so I'm a little bit closer to like hearing like all that. So I'll hear sirens go off like all the time. And so I'm like getting on to see like what's going on. Why are there sirens? And
you could get a police radio for your shelf.
I should. I mean,
Just
at this point,
Omaha Scanner.
yeah, that's who I follow. And it's just interesting because in the summer, it was like every single day I was seeing, oh, they're going because there's a homicide. Oh, there's a homicide, blah, blah, blah. And it was just shocking to me to see the like how often it was just like every day somebody is like, there's a homicide. And I think it's hard. It's still hard, even though I'm downtown and I'm hearing it and I'm around it. Those aren't people. They're more statistics to me. It's just like, well, there's another person, and you just see it so much that it's almost kind of like you've kind of been numb to it. Of like, oh, there's another one. Like that's just downtown Omaha, or that's North Omaha. And so that I think it was really interesting when you listen later. To what they talk about, just like it's not just a number, it's a person, and just like that was really cool for me to hear. But yeah, it's just, and yeah, this year's just been so crazy. I just can't imagine what impact that had on all these homicides.
Yeah, and as you read the article that the Omaha World Herald puts out, it starts to make sense, and I actually grew a deeper appreciation for places like Abide and these community organizations that, like, they've had to cancel so many things. Like, police have a lot of events where they try to go out, like Fun in the Park, Cops and Bobbers. They were both canceled. National Night Out, all of these things that they try to do to build trust in the community. Plus, school is, not canceled. It wasn't canceled, but, people are out of schools. And so for a lot of kids, that's a safe place where they can have meals, stay out of trouble, and a lot of those types of things were just canceled this year because of COVID, and then plus you've got racial tensions that go even higher, and so many things contributing to this that it does bring to light, how deeply impactful like things like Abide are. And when you can't do the things that you have done, we see the ripple effects of that, and it makes us want to be in the community more and put on those, it just, shows the highlights, how important those events are, and being with people and giving people options, being mentors. I saw last night, I know you guys are going to love this, that I'm bringing up college football, but even last night, the guy who won the Heisman Trophy, from Alabama, the wide receiver, one of the people he thanked was his mentor who drove him day after day to places that he needed to get, and so all of those things are huge. And so when you can't meet together with that person and accountability drops and all of that, I think a lot of this is a result of it.
Definitely.
Yeah. I don't know if there's much more to add to that, but I do think it piggybacks well on the conversation you have with
I think
Josh.
like just to maybe end it out is like like Rachel said, like we're seeing a statistic, but we don't know the situation that happened around that.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's what I want to care about is like, was there domestic abuse? Was there a situation like those are highlighting the things that we need to be caring about and investing in. And so I don't know.
Definitely.
Agreed. All right. Up next, Alex, you get to sit down with Josh Dotzler of Abide.
All right, so without any further ado, here I am with Josh Dotzler. We're going to have a conversation today just about justice, about biblical justice. At CCC, we've been in the middle of a conversation, for a long time about this, but intentionally having this conversation in our message series over the last couple weeks, and so grateful for the ability to have it. I know you came in and talked to our staff about it October, November, something like that. And it was fun to hear your story, hear your heart. And you've been having these conversations in a lot of different places. And so, but before that, around the Omaha area, I think a lot of people, know, have heard of you, know who you are, at least the organization that you represent, but would love to hear a little bit about who you are, maybe your history, what you're currently doing, family, anything you want to expose to our vast audience. We would love to get to know you.
Number one, thank you for having me on the podcast, and excited to speak to the vast audience of listeners. Love just how you're tackling these difficult conversations. And justice is definitely one of those conversations that I think is more relevant now than ever. And so excited to dive into that and tackle that a little bit. My story, born and raised in Omaha, one of 14 children. My parents' favorite scripture verse is be fruitful and multiply.
There you go.
And we were talking about this the other day, but people always ask me, man, are you going to have as many kids as your parents? No way.
Yeah.
No desire for that. My wife and I have been married for 13 years, and we have 4 kids, Joshua, Joe, Juliana, and Jada. And my wife is half Mexican, half Thai. I'm half black, half white. And so I tell people our kids are the most beautiful mutts you've ever seen.
There you go.
My wife doesn't love it when I say that. But yeah, born and raised here. My parents started our nonprofit Abide about 30 years ago, located in North Omaha. My dad was a chemical engineer. Our family lived in the Millard, Omaha area. Felt like God was calling him to some sort of full-time ministry. Kind of dreamed about being overseas, and told God we'll move anywhere except for North Omaha. And you know how it goes. Don't tell God what you won't do.
Yeah.
And so ends up in North Omaha. And my dad's a white guy from Iowa. Just wondering, any white guys from Iowa listen to the podcast right now?
We actually have a white guy from Iowa that is on the podcast.
One of the hosts?
Yeah, yes.
There's always at least one.
Yes,
like in
there
the
he is. Shout out to Eric.
Shout out to Eric. My dad grew up small town Iowa, population 300. And so my mom's African-American from Washington, D.C. I mean, they got married. They had just a collision of 2 cultures and stories. And my mom would tell my dad he was racist. And just the culture shock my dad had when he moved into North Omaha.
Yeah.
And becoming the minority and what that taught him and what it taught us. And as a nonprofit, our mission is to revitalize the inner city one neighborhood at a time. And so really the heart behind it is fighting for justice for those in our community that haven't had the same opportunities as many people outside our community. And so grew up under that, kind of, loved what my parents were doing, but I tell people I didn't want to do it.
Yeah.
And part of it was we had our house shot at, stuff stolen. I mean, just a lot of negative experiences that caused a lot of fear inside of me. And so I wanted to do everything I could to get out. Basketball, I thought, was my ticket out. Got a scholarship to play ball at Creighton when I was a junior in high school. And my freshman year in college, with 6 games left to go, got tripped, fell on my knee, tore my PCL, and kind of wrecked my athletic career.
Yeah.
But God used it to get my attention. And following that year would just kind of fully surrender my life to Christ and say, God, wherever you want me to go, that's where I'll go. Just don't lead me to North Omaha, and I don't want to be a pastor. Yeah. And so ended up back in North Omaha, and was a part of leading our church, been a part of our nonprofit for almost 12 years now. And it's just been more than anything, I think, over those 12 years, God has changed me. And I think that's part of, for me, just the story behind even this conversation of justice is just how my heart, my perspective, my paradigm has been shifted and shaped over the course of these last 12 years.
That's cool. A couple of questions that pop up in my mind. When did you decide to go with the all J names?
All the J's?
Yeah.
Good question. I've been obviously married my wife. Her name's Jen. Okay. And I don't know what it was. She wanted to name our first son Joshua.
Okay.
I didn't want to do it because I'm like, what if he grows up and doesn't want the same name as his dad?
Yeah.
And then once we kind of started to head down that road, there was no turning back. We actually have a dog named Jet, by the way, too.
Okay, perfect. That is perfect. I can attest. I do have the same name as my dad.
Okay.
But I actually go by my middle name. And we don't have the same full name.
The same name.
Yeah, they just always called me Alex. So
okay.
And I'm very thankful because my dad's middle name is Ferris.
Okay.
And so if they would have done the same thing and called me that middle name, I just feel like, I mean, no offense if there's any Ferrises that listen, but I feel like my life would have just turned out a little bit differently.
A little different.
Not bad, not worse, not anything else, but just different, I think. And so I
think you might be right.
Yeah, I'm grateful for that. And so, and the other thing is, I mean, you said you got hurt your freshman year of college. Yeah. I mean, for a wrecked career, you still had a pretty solid career at Creighton, right? So
finished out all right.
Yeah.
The next 2 years were pretty tough.
Yeah.
And but senior year finished out well, and just in the grand scheme of things, to be able to play at Creighton, to play on some good teams, man, such a blessing from God.
Yeah, I was just down the road. We graduated
right
same year high school, but down at Grace, and we quite weren't on the same level.
We never got to play against you guys.
Well, yeah, I don't know why. You guys just wouldn't schedule us. They didn't want
We couldn't figure out who was going to be home and who was going to be away.
You guys outlasted Grace, so shout out to that. So anyway, we're going to have a conversation, and obviously being a part of Creighton and just, the platform God has given you, through experience and getting to know guys that are even playing right now in the NBA. And you've recently had some of these conversations around justice. Obviously this year in sports, this has had a big influence, equality, justice, movements like Black Lives Matter, and people have all sorts of opinions and thoughts on that. And one of the things that really struck me as you were talking to us as a staff, obviously, like even that phrase Black Lives Matter has been, a heated thing, I think, especially in the church, because people see the organization and they're like, I don't want to be a part of that. But one of the things that was interesting to me that you talked about was you're like, I never had to post about that. I never said that. I didn't have to do any of like the social media trends for people to, believe that I care about that. So talk a little bit about like your decision there and just what that's meant. I thought that was interesting when you talked to our staff.
I think even just in general, obviously this last year has been crazy when it comes to justice. You talked about the sports stuff. Recently, I was at Creighton and with Kyle Corver, Anthony Tolliver, guys who I played with. Anthony Tolliver. Yeah. Corver, I played with his brother, but he's been a supporter of our organization. They recently were at the Vatican talking to the Pope about some of these matters. And I think for many of us, you look back on your life and you realize that God has been setting you up for moments like this. And a reporter reached out to me and said, man, did you see where Kyle and Anthony were? I said, no. I said, where were they? He said, the Vatican. I mean, can you believe it? 2 guys from Creighton. And so I think like when I look at those guys, when I look at myself, when I look at what's gone on, I feel like there's some things that are out of your control and some things that God is just preparing you for. And I think when it comes to justice, we all view these conversations through the filter that we've experienced, that either we've been raised under, our personal experiences. And so in years past, when there have been some racial tension and some things have happened, you see people go and they start to protest. Yeah. And they'll raise up signs and they'll say stuff. One of the phrases that we came up with years ago is, let's not protest, let's invest. And protest is such a response to what's going on. Investing is a lifestyle that positions you and says, this is what I'm for.
Yeah, that's good.
And so when it came to like the Black Lives Matter conversation, language, when it came to like media posting, it was neat to see that many people reached out to us, not because of anything that we were doing differently, but because of what we had been doing all along. Yeah. And because of what we were standing for. And I think, I like you mentioned, I never once posted Black Lives Matter. And part of it was because I didn't have to. Yeah. I felt like all that we were doing was already representing the conversation about Black lives and fighting for justice and equality. And so I never felt the need to have to use that specific statement, use that specific phrase. The other thing was I wasn't even really aware of the organization. Yeah. It was a white pastor that came to me one time and said, Josh, you know about this organization and you know about this, and I had to look into it based on what he said. But I think for most African Americans, up until it became kind of a larger debate, I don't think they were even aware of the organization. Yeah. It represented a movement. It represented a heart that, man, for generations, Black lives have been treated a certain way. And it's time to stand up and do something similar to what happened during the civil rights era and different times and seasons where we saw people take strong stands to stand up for specifically the Black community. So I felt like, man, when you're living a certain way and you're investing in the Black community specifically, it doesn't matter. Honestly, it doesn't matter what you say, because the other reality is there are people who are saying that. Yeah. Whose lives are not, in my mind, backing that phrase up. Yeah. And so I want to lead by example, and I think that's one of the things that we've tried to do just during this season.
Yeah, and it's good to not have to just do something because it's in vogue and everybody's doing it, but to have a track record of we've been saying this, with what God's been doing in our lives and things like that. So as you've had, some of these conversations, and obviously as justice has kind of, peaked this year, at least conversations around it's been good, but especially I think in the sports world, what are some of the things just in 2020, and maybe it can have to do with, social justice or racial justice or whatever, but just what was it like for you? I know you wrote a book in 2020 that about the COVID crisis. So just tell us a little bit as like the CEO of Abide, as you're going through this, as you are wrestling internally, you've got kids that you're trying to navigate. What was 2020 like now that we're past it, for you?
Yeah. I mean, I could probably talk about 2020 for the next hour because I feel like so much happened. And for us, it started off with in February, March, our family got pretty sick. And our son was sick. My wife got sick. She actually ended up in the ER twice. I got sick. Almost all of our kids got sick. So I remember coming into, it was like the NBA shut down, college basketball shut down. And then it was like businesses started shutting down. And then we're working remotely. And I remember the tension initially in being sick and trying to manage a team remotely from my home. And it was just kind of a surreal thing. But one of the things we said early on was, I think it's Craig Rochelle who has a statement, limitation drives innovation.
Sounds like him.
And sounds like something he would say.
Yeah.
And so we said that from the beginning. We said, man, let's let the limitations of the season lead to innovation. And so it was super cool to see our team just pivot in so many different areas. We just launched a capital campaign trying to raise $5 million.
Wow.
Literally in February, we launched a capital campaign. We had to put that on pause.
Yeah.
And we started to just try to meet practical needs. And so on the organizational side, we saw hundreds of thousands of people get these practical needs met through food, through household, through diapers. We saw projects that we had on our capital campaign, even though we paused the capital campaign, still get funded.
Wow.
And still get accomplished because people, for different reasons, said, you know what, we still want to be a part of the solution.
That's cool.
Even in the middle of this pandemic. So that was super cool. The two things that I'll highlight for our conversation is, number one, like you said, I ended up writing a book. And I didn't have that on the radar at all. And in the beginning of the crisis was having a lot of conversations with pastors and leaders and was watching the world's response to COVID-19. And I was amazed at how almost every night I would turn on the TV and celebrities were throwing concerts to raise money for frontline workers. And people were using their influence to raise money and resources to provide more food. And I had so many conversations. I know a lot of churches and individuals did things, but I truly believe the church is the hope of the world.
Yeah.
And that our faith compels us, specifically in challenging times, to be a part of the solution.
Amen. Yeah.
And honestly, it's something we've experienced for 30 years, but sometimes the church has been slower to act.
Yeah.
And there was just this stirring in my heart. And we were driving, my wife and I were driving. I just said, man, like, I was sharing my heart with her about the church. We got to do something. We've got to raise money. We should be on the front lines. We should be providing the most support to our city. They should look at the church in times like this and say, oh my goodness, the church cares. But a lot of the conversations we were trying to think so strategically and trying to, let's really count the cost. And I just didn't feel like we responded as quickly. And she was like, man, you should start writing. And so one night I just started writing. And it was two hearts. The word crisis in Japanese has two meanings, danger and opportunity. And it was with the heart that the church is the hope of the world. But it was also the reality that the crisis has revealed something about the church that we don't want to be true. And so I start writing, and honestly, within 2 weeks, this book came together. And it was neat to see how God used it, because that was before the racial tension really kind of broke out. And I felt like the book, it not only addressed the COVID-19 crisis, but it really talked a lot about how we live with compassion and how we go and love our neighbor, people who are different than us. And then the racial tension starts to arise. And within that, the racial tension, starting with Ahmaud Arbery and going to George Floyd and these conversations, I mean, I don't know if I can say this on this podcast, but I've never had more white people reach out to me for help.
Yeah.
I mean, it was phone calls from 7 a.m. till 7 p.m.
Wow.
From pastors to basketball coaches to, I mean, you name it, politicians, and people just trying to understand why.
Yeah.
But then also interested in how they can be a part of the solution and be a part of the conversation. And it was one of the greatest times personally, because these are conversations that I would say we've wanted to have and have tried to have, but they were so pressing, relevant. People wanted to lean into them.
Yeah.
And so there was a beauty in the sense of people's openness to listen and learn and hear. But I'll tell you what, after a couple of weeks, I was so emotionally just tired, exhausted, but so grateful just for that. I feel like God opened up a window and a door to have the conversations like we're having today.
Yeah.
In a way that I would say we just hadn't had before.
Yeah. And I think one of the unique things about Omaha too is, I mean, just the within reach network between churches and things like that you're able to even see like how God's writing a narrative way before that. That's not about, racial tension and things like that, but it's about building trust and building unity. Now, when things like this do happen, we have a safe friendships, you know, that pastors are able to call you and have those kind of conversations. So that's so cool.
And I'll say this too, one couple cool things that happen with like within reach and just through the pastors networks. I'd say pastors were one of the first to respond and reach out when some of the racial tension broke out. And they were some of the first ones to say, man, let me listen, let me hear, let me learn. I want to grow in my compassion and empathy for what's going on. Yeah. And so pastors rallied. I mean, we had a prayer gathering, united in prayer, that was powerful. Yeah. We had another gathering. So there was some cool things too that united the church in our city. And I think you grow closer together when you go through hard things. And this was one of those seasons where we were all experiencing some hard things together. And I do think it grew our relationships.
Yeah, that's cool. So I'm going to ask just a series of questions that people, have thrown at us to while we're having you on this. Some of it's maybe challenging, confusing, just coming from people's feelings. One of them is obviously 2020 was a lot about identifying just failures that have taken place over so many generations inside of our country. Obviously, we've got a stained past. We live in a great country, and we love it, and there's a lot of pride, but then it just uncovered some of the warts that we have. And so how do we continue to press, like where would you say the things that have been revealed have led to healing, and where do you think, like as we move into 2021, how do we continue to press further into justice?
Yeah. I mean, I couldn't agree more. I think, crisis is the great revealer. And the crisis, the challenges that we went through with race, and it really revealed some of the things that are on the inside of us. And even personally, I feel like God has had me on this journey for the last couple of years in really understanding, I'd say, more of the root issues and challenges when it comes to race. I'm half black, half white. I grew up in North Omaha all my life. So I was in predominantly African-American cultures, communities, but I went to school at Bellevue West. I went to Christian schools. I went to church for many years at churches out West. And so I feel like I've had a very diverse upbringing, but I don't think I always understood the root and some of the challenges that the black community really was facing. And even part of my story is in growing up in North Omaha. I shared it earlier, but I wanted to leave. And I would say I viewed people that lived in the inner city, specifically black people, as a part of the problem. They were the ones shooting up my house. Yeah. They were the ones when we were outside playing that would get in fights. They were the ones that were stealing stuff. I mean, I had a lot of negative experience. And then if I were to just be honest, in sports, most of the kids who had trouble on the teams that weren't the most team-oriented players were black kids. Yeah. All of them coming from rough past. I didn't understand that part at the time. And so when my wife and I moved back to North Omaha, when we got out of college, I started to see the community and the people, I would say, just through a more adult lens. And I started to see these young people at age 2, 3, 4 running the streets by themselves, and 8-year-olds who were literally outside all night. No parents told them to come in and do their homework and encourage them or was there for them, and just started to see that, wow, these people are being shaped at a young age, that they're heading in a direction in life that's very consistent with the options they've been given and with the resources that they've been given. And for me, any of us left to ourselves and left to be in a context like that, we would probably end up in a similar situation. And so I think God started to give me a perspective and a picture that was so much bigger than just the actions that I saw people and the behaviors that I saw from the Black community as a whole. And it started to shift my perspective. There's a story not too long ago where I was driving and I saw a young person. He was in handcuffs, and there was a police officer right by him. And the kid looked like he had been in one of our programs. And so I was like, I'm going to go over and see if I know this kid. And so I go over there, and I did know him. So I start talking to him. The police officer's standing there, white police officer, 23-year-old Black kid in handcuffs. White police officer, nicest guy in the world, was being great. So I just start asking him about him and his family. And he starts to tell me that he has 3 daughters, and how one of the daughters, his youngest daughter, who's 23 years old, is living at home, and he's getting to retirement age, but he's going to keep working so that he can pay off his kids' school. And as we're talking, the Black kid who's in handcuffs looks up at the officer and says, "Man, I wish I had parents who supported me, who cared for me." He said, I wish I had a place to stay. Then he goes on to talk about the fact that since he was young, since he was 13 years old, he's been on his own. And I remember working with him as a 13-year-old. We didn't know where he was going to be staying that night. We didn't know where he was going to be. He was all over the place. He talked about how in high school he would have to skip and find the different buses to get to school. He'd wear the same clothes to school where he'd smell bad. Kids would start making fun of him. So he started to get tough, and he started to get into fights. I mean, you just see all these different decisions that were out of his control that now were leading to him going back to prison. He's also 23 years old. He's got 5 children. And so I look at his life, and I look at the police officers' daughters, their life and their trajectory. And I can tell you what, they're going in very different directions. And much of the officer, his daughters, much of the trajectory of their life isn't a result of decisions that they've made.
Yeah.
It's a result of decisions he's made and his wife's made and others have made. And the same is true with those in our community. And so as I look at the root, as I look at our past as a country, I've been learning more about our history this last year than ever before. And as I'm going back and I'm looking at the laws, and as I'm looking at the way the narrative of our country has been shaped over the years, there's not a country I'd rather live in.
Yeah.
But I see how we got to where we are today.
Yeah.
I see how we've been where we've been in our past. And I think before you can move forward, there has to be a recognition of where you've been. And there has to be an understanding of the foundation. I mean, before you can repent and turn away from your sins, you've got to say, man, I recognize I'm a sinner.
Yeah.
And I need a savior. And I think the same is true when it comes to our history and the racism and the challenges. I think it is impossible to understand truly where we are without looking backwards. And without taking the time to understand our history as a nation. And so one of the things that I've been doing, and I actually think, I mean, I've given this presentation several times this last year, but I kind of started with Christ Community. I said, I think we just got to lay out the history. And we got to lay out our country was founded on slaves, African-American slaves. And then it wasn't until hundreds of years later that laws started to get changed. But guess what? Laws changed, but some of the ways people lived didn't change. And so there was the 13th Amendment, then the Emancipation Proclamation, and then there was Juneteenth, which was several years after the law had actually changed, that people in every state started to become free. But then you've got Jim Crow laws. And so people lived under these laws that created more separation, segregation. And so when you just look at, and then there's redlining. I mean, there are some key indicators that help us understand how we got to where we are today. And so I know I'm sharing a lot, and I'll let you ask a question, but even when you talk about the phrase Black Lives Matter, and people will say all lives matter, I agree 110% all lives matter. But when you just look at that narrative, the reality is in the founding of our country, people were made to feel like their lives didn't matter. And while there's been incredible progress over the years, there's still a narrative that has been shaped. I think it's the book White Fragility. It talks about how, and I might mess this up, but before there was race, there was racism. And the idea was that before it was about like a black and white thing, it was about the exploitation of people who could help you accomplish what you wanted to accomplish. So the slaves, there wasn't this race, black, white thing back then. It was just, these slaves are going to help us build our country. And then that narrative grew, well, these slaves are black and we're white. And so then the whole race issue started to become more and more permanent. And then that's the narrative that's played out for years. I like the word narrative even better than like systemic racism, because it has been a system over time, but really it's been a story that's been told.
Yeah.
And we all start to believe the dominant narrative that's shared.
Yeah. One interesting question is, as you were even sharing, like you grew up in North Omaha and you're like, you shared, the guys on my team that were the most disruptive, the people that made me want to move out of North Omaha and not stay here were, the black people that I was around and seeing and making some of the problems that you were talking about earlier, the one shooting at your house and all of that. So would you say, as you're looking at your life, would you say that's driven by racism, that's driven by fear, it's driven by ignorance? What would you say is like convicted you to make those changes, to first become aware of that? I think you admitting that is like a big awareness, but then how do you start to change, that narrative in your own life?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's probably been driven by all those things. I think fear drives a lot of it. And we're afraid of what we don't understand. We're afraid of what we don't know. I mean, I'll take it up a level to where it's not even, getting shot at or stolen. We would go to my mom's side of the family every other year. They're in Washington, D.C. We would see my dad's side of the family all the time. Most of them live in Bennington. We go to my dad's side of the family, most polite people you'll ever meet in your life. I mean, a bunch of people from Iowa, just smile, everybody's smiling, having a good time, never arguments. We go to my mom's side of the family, Washington, D.C. Man, first thing they see you, they start making fun of you. Man, what you wearing? Why you looking like that?
Yeah.
Hey, nephew. And arguing back and forth. Like the conversation, the interactions look so different. And for me, it was like, man, I don't know if I want to be around this. And so I think fear, just the idea of being different. Another example I would say is leadership. In the black community, let's just take Omaha, there are not a lot of, I would say, thriving churches based on the standards I grew up with.
Yeah.
Lots of people, money, resources, having impact in that way. And so I grew up with a narrative based on the conferences I was going to and the things I was learning that a lot of the black pastors and leaders aren't good leaders. And what I've come to realize, I talked to a black pastor this last year, one of the largest African-American churches in our city. He's been leading for 15 or 16 years. In that time, he's done one capital campaign. His goal was to raise $1.6 million. They raised 1.5. I know churches, organizations that have raised, and we've been fortunate in what we've been able to do, millions of dollars. And so the way my God has shifted my heart and mind is I recognize, man, if you go fishing in a pond where there's one fish, I don't care how strategic you are. I don't care how passionate you are. I don't care what your plan looks like. You're going to catch one fish. If you go fishing in a pond that's stocked, I don't care, vice versa. You throw that line in there, you're pulling them out.
Yeah.
And so I've begun at a new level to understand the challenges that the African American community is facing. And I mean, just in that example, when it comes to fundraising, if hardly nobody owns a business in your church, if you have no CEOs or individuals leading at the highest level in a business, if you have no stability within that congregation, it's going to be hard to raise resources.
Yeah.
Again, the same is true on the other side. And I think so often we unintentionally just go where we're most comfortable. And we go to churches, we live in communities, we go to schools that are most consistent with who we are. And I'll be honest with you, the biggest argument I've had with God over the last 12 years is, why would you send me to a community that's not consistent with who I think I am? I don't want to live in a community with crime and violence. Man, God, I want a newer, a nicer house. I want to be a part of an organization or church that has nicer facilities and nicer things.
Yeah.
That's been the biggest argument that my wife and I have had with God. And I mean, honestly, in the recent years, we've come to recognize, wow, one of the biggest blessings that God has given us is living in community of poverty, because it's shifted the way we see the world. Not that we still don't have desires and wants, and I mean, we struggle with that stuff all the time, but I recognize that many people living in poverty, especially minorities, the Black community, it's a generational thing. And it's a lot of times not just decisions that they're making, but decisions other people before them have made.
Yeah. How about white guilt? Like, I think one of the big things that a lot of people, especially that are white, and I've even felt this in some ways, because I was raised, by two white parents, and that's just the cards I was dealt. Like, I didn't get to choose that either. And nobody really knows the stories behind anybody's lives, around those types of things. And so there's times where I'm like, as a leader, as a man, as somebody who's working at a predominantly white church that is blessed, and God's been super faithful and kind to this church for a really long time. There's times where I'm also like, but neither me or my wife's parents went to college. They both picked up themselves by their bootstraps. They worked really, really hard to have anything. We didn't have like a lot of what the narrative is that people would consider, privilege. Even for me, I've realized like I didn't even live in a monoethnic house because my parents had foster kids, and I've got siblings from all of that stuff. But there's a lot of times where I felt like some of the narrative is like, just because you're white, and you're male and middle class, you should feel guilty for the sins of, your forefathers that I had nothing to do with. And so obviously I've done my own work with God in that, but I think that's, as I'm having conversations with a lot of people in my, my shoes that are like, man, I give faithfully. I serve at places like Abide. I've taken mission trips and love people. We've done all of these things, and yet you still like, what do we got to do to dig ourselves out of this mess that we didn't create? And so I'm sure you've had a lot of those fun conversations with people, even pastors that are calling you and that are maybe those initial conversations are led by guilt, or it's exhausting sometimes too, to be white and feel like I didn't create this mess, but here I am. I have to clean it up. So what are those conversations? How, like, even your dad, I'm sure, has had, being a white guy in this type of environment, had a lot of those conversations. So how do you speak into white guilt, and how do we continue to combat that as a white person?
Yeah. I mean, I think first and foremost, I don't think God wants us to carry that guilt. And number one, I don't think any of us can carry the responsibility of what's happened alone. And so I do think there's a difference between, number one, guilt and responsibility. And I think nobody should carry the guilt. I'll say this too. Life is hard. And I mean, I listen to your story and I listen to others people's story, and most of the white people I know, they haven't had it easy in life. They've had to work hard. They've had to do the things that many people have to do to be successful. And I think the challenge is when we try to diminish that aspect of people's story, and then we try to just give them full responsibility for the narrative that's been playing out for years. And I think it's not either or, it's both and.
Yeah.
And it's like, yep, life is hard. People have lived incredibly difficult stories. I don't think we should feel guilty, but I do think we all have a responsibility. And part of the reason I think we all have a responsibility, for me, is as followers of Jesus, when he says the greatest commandment is to love God and to love your neighbor as you love yourself. To love your neighbor, people in that context understood that to love yourself wasn't just personal, it was to love people that are like me. To love your neighbor was to love people who are not like you. And we see this with Jesus. I mean, Pastor Mark, I just heard him talking about this other day when he's talking about, justice and the woman at the well. And Jesus intentionally went to people and places that were different to help, I think, model and also be a part of the solution. And if we know anything, Jesus didn't create the problem, but he sure understood that he was a part of the solution to the challenge. And so I think as followers of Jesus, we all carry a responsibility that says, I want to be more like Christ. And to be more like Christ means to stand in the gap for people who are different than me. I think on the practical side of things too, I think, again, if I just look at the narrative of our history and our nation, you start to understand this isn't a personal thing. This is a thing that represents all of us. And I think when we take it personal, it definitely can feel heavy. We can feel guilty. We can feel like it's all on us. But I think if we think in terms of collectively and recognize, you know what? If I'm white, I've been a part of a dominant culture. And in so many ways, when you're a minority, I don't know if you've ever been on a mission trip anywhere or you've spent time as a minority in a culture or community. When you do those things, you feel it. We lived in Mexico for 6 months when I was growing up, and we used to go to Mexico all the time. And when you are a minority in a culture, man, it just feels weird.
Yeah.
And you recognize, I don't speak the language. I don't understand the cultures. That's what, it's hard to understand because we're all in the same nation. But that's what the average black person feels when they're in an environment that's predominantly white. And so for the average African American, they've had to learn to speak the white language, to understand the values, to celebrate what they're celebrating. And so there's something about being a minority in a majority culture. And there's something about if we're a part of the majority culture, hey, let's use whatever privilege or power we have to invest in those in need. One of the coolest pictures during 2020 was we were doing kind of a North Omaha rally. Myron, Jameson, I mean, a whole bunch of guys from the community. It was so fun because we were all together and speaking the same language. Looking out into the crowd, Ron Smith was there. Looking out into the crowd was my dad. White guy in the crowd. He's responsible for all those black leaders being able to stand up that day. And number one, he could have been standing up there with us and in front of us, but he chose to stand in the crowd. And for me, he's such a picture of someone who's leveraged his voice, his influence for the sake of some of us. Pastor Mark Ashton was standing in that crowd. Man, I could look at myself. I can look at guys like Myron and say, wow, he's leveraged his influence for us to be able to keep doing what we're doing. And so I would say we can't do everything, but I do think God has called us to do something. And at the very least, I think the minority community needs more advocates. And so even when you just make a statement and you stand to say, I'm with my minority brothers and sisters, I'm with Black lives, Black leaders, like I'm with, and you don't even have to say that. You can say, I'm with Josh.
Yeah.
I'm with Myron. I love these guys. I support these guys. That advocacy starts to build a community of people that are all going in the same direction.
Yeah, that's good. I know one of the experiences my wife and I have had over the last year, since our youngest daughter is deaf, and that's obviously like one of those, I mean, it's a minority in our culture and society, and she's got these little magnets that stick to her ears so she can hear. And like, I know like everywhere we go, it's like, even though we're white, we walk into this place and everyone's like just looking at this little girl with glasses and just curious because she's different, you know, and when people are, you know, gawking and, what's wrong with her? He like ask all these kind of questions that, because people have no filter. But then when you have somebody that comes up to you is like, they can identify it. You know, we've had a few doctors like come up to us and like, oh my gosh, how are her CIs going and things like that. You just feel all of a sudden more understood and all of that. But then when you're just walking through as like the minority and there's like almost a shame of like, I've got this. So it's at a different level, but it's this conversation.
It's the same thing.
Yeah.
And we talk about the idea of being bridge builders all the time. I mean, we're called to be a bridge. A bridge that ultimately connects people to Jesus, but a bridge of love, a bridge of hope. And it's amazing what can happen when we would just say, you know what? When I see a minority, I'm going to engage with them. I'm going to make them feel comfortable. I'm going to make them feel at home. I'm going to go out of my way. I love the challenge at church to go visit North Omaha, to take a trip. Because when we become the minority, we start to see life through a whole different lens, a whole different perspective. And I believe God uses it to really break our hearts.
That's good. That's good. So as we have conversations with friends, family members that are like, no, like this is just dumb. I've done nothing wrong. Like Black Lives Matter, stupid. This whole thing is dumb. Like racial tension. It's all kind of a made up narrative. You know, there's only one race. It's the human race and all of those kind of things that I think that they have some deep biblical truths to them, you know, I think, but also they can be flawed. At what point do you say, okay, it's not worth my time to continue to try to convince somebody else of their guilt or their place and how they can leverage their influence and actually start plugging that time into someplace that can make a difference?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I probably lean heavily on the let's not talk about it, let's be about it side. And I recognize the tension. There's people you love and there's people you want to see things a certain way. And so you're going to do everything you can to try to encourage them. The old saying, a man with an argument is at the mercy of a man with an experience. And so number one, I would say the best thing we can share is our own experience and our own story. And I think ultimately, when people see us change, it creates a level of intrigue that says, man, I want to hear your story.
Yeah.
I want to hear what you have to say. And so I would say, don't use information, use your experience, which maybe means you have to get an experience.
Yeah.
And you've got to go to where minorities are and interact with them. But I would say, even on the experience side, spend your time investing in what's working or investing in being a part of the solution. Because I think people see that. I think ultimately with our time, we only have so much time. We only have so much resource. And I'm just a huge proponent in spending it, trying to invest in those people and places that are already making a difference.
That's good. That's good. Last couple questions. So one of the things, you know, that's alarming, and we talked about it a little bit earlier on this podcast. You haven't heard it yet because we haven't recorded that part, but was just Omaha has seen a 61% increase in homicides over 2020, and we're making a lot of inroads at lowering gun violence, homicides, all that. I know Abide's been a huge part. You guys have gotten, you know, awards from the community and been a great community partner with our Omaha Police Department and things like that. And I remember, you know, the first time I ever went, you know, to the campus, you know, over a decade ago, just seeing that homicide map, you know, of all the red dots and where they concentrate. Most of them are in North Omaha, and that's slowly, by God's grace, gone down and down and down as you guys have been, you know, putting lighthouses in these blocks and things like that. So as you see that, how does that like make you feel? You know, like you've put all this effort in, and I think the other part of that narrative that I hear from people is around that whole Black Lives Matter kind of conversation of like, well, they don't matter to one another. Like, why is there all this black on black crime, you know, and we want to throw in that, or we want to throw, you know, an abortion, you know, statistics inside of there compared to like a white community and people that are impoverished and all of that kind of stuff. So as you, just as a leader in Omaha, hear that statistic and hear those arguments towards, hey, why don't you respect one another? Why don't you just stop killing each other? All of those brash things that we can throw out. How do you feel about that? How do we continue to move forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think, first of all, it breaks your heart.
Yeah.
And just recently, we were sharing a picture on a text thread of one of the kids who recently lost his life, who was a part of our church and programs, you know, going back 8-9 years ago. And so it's shocking how many of those individuals either we know, we've worked with, or they're connected to somebody we know. And so it breaks your heart, number one. But number two, going back to what I shared earlier, it's hard to fully understand the environments these kids are growing up in, and how it leads to destructive behavior. And I'll never forget some of the experiences I had where, I mean, we're at church on Sunday and I'm interacting with a young person and we're talking about getting together the next week. And then Monday night, I'm watching the news and I see him on the news for armed robbery. Or we're at a kid's house, or we're at a house, we're having lunch with some young kids. And the next week, they're arrested in our church for murder. Or a kid who was one of the most joy-filled kids I had ever been around, him and his sister put in prison because they murdered somebody. And part of the tension for me, or the challenge, was like, man, these are good kids. Like, man, when you're around them, especially individually, oh my goodness, they're good kids. They got dreams of playing basketball and dreams of going to school and dreams of being this. They get in these environments that pull something out of them, peer pressure, and honestly, the only thing they know to do, which is to try to survive and to try to get by. And then they make a decision in a split second or in some moments that completely destroy their lives. And so the closer I get to the people who are actually doing the destruction, the more I recognize how much of it is not, I mean, it's not their fault. If you train a dog to be a killer, he's going to be a killer. If you raise your child, I mean, how many of us, shoot, I'm doing the work I'm doing. Why? I'm following the footsteps of my parents. Their lifestyle, what I grew up watching and what they modeled before me, even though I didn't even want to necessarily do what they're doing, that's what I knew. That's what I understood growing up. The heart they gave me, the way they loved Jesus. I mean, imagine growing up in an environment where you have none of that. And we know God can change things. But I'm just telling you, the more my heart breaks, because this is where I can agree. There is tons of black on black crime. There's a lot of chaos that happens in communities like the inner city. But man, knowing those people doing that and the chaos that's going back and forth. I mean, right now on our campus, when the weather was nice, we got 10 to 15 kids that are roaming our campus with no adult supervision between the age of 5 and probably 14.
Wow.
One night we caught them, they lit a fire on our outdoor basketball court. I mean, they're just running wild by themselves. We went to their parents. They stole a little money from us. So we went to their parents' house and said, hey, you know, we want to work with you guys. Kids stole a little money, not a big deal, but we want to work with you. Parents got mad at us. Said, get away. And so I can't stress enough how unimaginable the circumstances surrounding these young people's lives. Martin Luther King, he said, man, you can't expect somebody to pick up themselves by their bootstraps if they've got no boots. And again, I know we've made progress as a nation. I'm not acting like we're where we were, but I know we have a long way to go. And I know in the community that we serve, there are a lot of young people growing up without supervision, without parents, and then not only that, without the resources that many of us are able to provide for our children. And so the results of their life are actually results that you can predict looking at them at 5, 6, and 7 years old.
Yeah.
Because of how they're growing up.
Yeah. And I think proximity matters.
It matters.
You know? I mean, when we see things on the news and we see narratives about people we don't know, when I in college had a friend that murdered someone,
yes,
I'm like, this is just a normal person. Like,
Yep.
I could never see this person do that. Or when I growing up in the church and you're like, LGBTQ people,
Yep.
terrible. And then you've got a sibling that fits into that.
Changes
or
you.
you see somebody murder, or you have a boss that, ends up, getting on a list for child molestation. And you're
Right.
like, it changes your perspective. It doesn't
Yep.
change how wrong what they did was, but
Right.
a lot of times you just see people as statistics.
That's it.
Until you are actually present with them and you're like, man,
Yep.
this isn't an evil person. This is a
Right.
person God created, and they made terrible decisions, but then all of a sudden your heart starts to break because this isn't just a statistic. It's a real person, and you also want God to redeem them.
Right.
And so I think the church has a long way to come in understanding some of those things. So
And I'll just add on to that by saying, when you are present and you know these people or you're connected in some way, even though the statistics are higher in terms of the homicides, they're still so isolated in the situations and what they're connected to. So when you're present, sometimes, to be honest with you, it doesn't feel like there's a heightened number. Because it's like, oh, well, man, that one happened because of that. That one happened, because of that. You have better understanding for the context, the circumstances, what's surrounding. I mean, we dream of the day where there's zero.
yeah,
And that's what we're working towards. But I tell people all the time, 99% of the people living in North Omaha all want the same thing. They want to live in a great community. They want to be great neighbors. They want to do the right thing. But there are groups of people that are growing up with a lot of challenges, and without the family and structure and environment to help them succeed in different ways. And more than anything, my hope and prayer is that as the church, as people of God, we would be filled with a level of compassion that says, for us, we got to do more. We got to provide more opportunities. We got to bring more resources to the community. We got to get more people in the game, because there are too many kids that aren't having the opportunities that we know they should have.
so good. Well, I think this conversation could go on forever, and I'm sure in 2021, as a lot of, like I said, those things have been revealed, our bruises, our past, our history, it's painful to process, I think, as people, but I think God's going to continue to bring more healing, but usually more healing causes a little more surgery. You can't just treat the symptoms. We've got to treat, at its core. So I'm grateful for this conversation around, justice. If there's one thing, if you're like, hey, I can give one action step today to somebody that's listening, and they're like, I want to do something. I know that I'm a part of the problem, or I honestly don't see myself as a part of the problem, but I want to be a part of the solution more than I am. What would you say is just a quick action step for somebody?
First thing I think about is, man, come and see. Like, we got to learn. And I think as a church, you guys got, a website that people can get connected to and take a trip to North Omaha, volunteer. I think the more we can learn and understand, the more revelation God can give us, the more compassion we can live with, which ultimately will lead to other steps. So I'd say whatever you do, try to 1 or 2 times this year, find a way to serve, to get down to North Omaha, or, man, maybe there's people in your circles that that are different than you. Have a conversation with them. Try to learn, try to understand at a greater level.
That's good. That's so good. Well, Josh, thanks again for all you do in the city. Thanks for coming and contributing to this conversation. If people do want to, come down to Abide, they want to check out your campus, they want to serve, what are some just easy ways they can do that?
I'd say you can go to abideomaha.org. You can sign up, check out there, or you can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Abide Omaha.
Okay, sweet. We'll put all those plugs in there. Well, thanks again, Josh, for coming.
Thanks for having me, man.
And we'll see you later.
Thanks Alex for sitting down with Josh, and thanks to Josh for giving us some time to have that conversation. Super insightful. We're going to break it down just a little bit, but before we do, I have a little bit of fact checking I needed to do. There was at the beginning of the conversation, they talked about white guys from Iowa, and my name got thrown in the mix. I would just like to clarify that I live in Iowa.
That's what I meant.
But I am not from Iowa.
Yeah. There's a big difference.
There's a big difference. All right.
difference.
Now that I've clarified that.
He drives
funny.
from Iowa every day.
Yeah.
Just to be
Resident of Iowa.
Yes, current resident. But we can move on now that that's cleared up.
Thank you. Well, I was just glad we thought about you.
Yeah, it was an honor.
So I apologize. Thanks for clearing that up. Yeah, it was a fun conversation. Like Josh and I kind of have been in church circle, even in growing up in basketball kind of circles, but never really had a ton of opportunities to connect deeply. So it was fun to get to do that a couple times this week. There's a lot of even similarities in our families and sizes and all that kind of stuff. And so grateful to interview him, but would love to hear some of your initial reactions and thoughts around some of those things. We shared it earlier as we did, but go.
I think one thing that stuck out to me, there's a couple of things that I had written down, but one thing that he said was a man with an argument is at the mercy of a man with experience.
I
was
love
like,
that.
oh my goodness, that is so good.
Boom.
Like, especially, I just feel like this past year, it's just been a lot of just argument, like constant argument. And I just think people are coming to this point where they're like, what do we do? How do we make this person understand? How do we make them? And it was just so good to hear him say like, well, you just got to go out there and show them. Like, you just have to have the experience. You have to go out there and be a part of the change and making the difference. And those people are going to see that. And then that's going to be better than any argument you could try and have against them. And so I thought that was just such a good thing that he said to
It was such a challenging thing for a lot of people to hear, I think, just because it's the whole actions speak louder than words.
Yeah.
And when we live on social media, most of the time, we all just live with words, right?
Yeah.
We post our arguments or whatever, our feelings and opinions, and just throw them out there into the ether. But so many times those things are not backed up with action.
Yeah, it was so good.
Yeah, I saw Tim Keller, he tweeted the other day, and that reminded me of it, that true gospel humility means I stop connecting every experience, every conversation with myself. And so I think meaning that when we're humble, we don't connect every single thing, like every person, every statistic with, well, I should have, I was able to do this even though I came from nothing and I had no money, and my mom and dad, they didn't. So these people don't have an excuse. And a lot of times we want to connect everything to how we would have handled it, or we would have, and one quote I'm always trying to like process is we judge everybody else by their actions and ourselves by our intentions. Yeah. So even if we do something, that we didn't mean to do, but it hurts somebody, we're like, oh, it's okay. It's okay that I, wasn't racially sensitive. It's okay that because I love those people. I didn't mean for it to happen, but it still hurts somebody. Yeah. And so as we continue to process that, I think that's important as well.
Yeah.
One thing that I loved that Josh spent some time talking on was just the narrative and kind of breaking that down, and how he used that word just to convey the message of, it's the story that we've been told. And so it's kind of made me, even in the past year, like reflecting on what's that story I've been told. And then the dominant pieces are the ones that I choose to believe. But I think a lot of self-reflection has really helped me to change my narrative, because I think a lot of us, especially, I don't know, I'm a millennial where I feel like I'm coming out of beliefs and a narrative that I grew up with, and I'm like, I don't feel great about this. And I think that there is that freedom in being able to change it. And so I felt like that was great even for us to look at that and see, what are other people's stories saying, and then, okay, we can change that for ourselves, and we're set up for, our lives are setting us up for where we're supposed to be right now. All the things that we've done are here for us to make a decision or a choice. So it's it was a lot to process. I personally listened to the message twice just because there was so much in there. But yeah.
And because you love Jays.
I do. I love
you
Creighton.
are a huge
I do
Creighton
love
fan. That
Creighton.
was your Twitter handle for a long time.
It's still my Twitter handle. I love the Jays.
Yeah, Jess, I was gonna say that stuck out to me too, but in a little different way, because I feel like the narrative has been used a lot this year, of just like the narrative, and I'm just like, okay, but what does that mean? Like, I don't really understand, what does that mean? And I think it really hit me when I was listening, and I feel like God kind of spoke to me of like, you as a Christian should understand the power of a narrative more than anyone, because I am giving you a narrative of who you are as a child of God. And like, you believe the narrative of like, you are a child of God, and like, this is how you walk and this is how you live. And like, that narrative and that power is in my life, and like, that's how I live my life. So that is a powerful thing. So just thinking about the other narratives that people are living by and how powerful that is too. I don't know, it just kind of hit me in a different way of like, I don't really understand why they keep saying this. Like, what does that really mean? But I just think it was interesting to be like, oh, I have my own narrative in my life that is very powerful. And
Well, to apply that narrative to everybody else, instead of it making it a statistic, but that same narrative of you being a child of God that's beloved, and he is recklessly chasing you down and loves you despite everything you've done. Like, it's hard enough to give ourselves that acceptance, but then to give somebody else that, to see that face, with a mugshot on a TV, or to not, consider, no matter what those people have done, they are cherished, and God is still pursuing them. Even though maybe society has given up on them, God is still pursuing them and wanting to redeem their stories. That's difficult. But I think at first we have to understand that about ourselves before we can even project that. And so I think that's why a lot of times we don't project that on others, because we don't even understand the value God has for our own life. Yeah. So you can't for somebody else.
Yeah.
It's really good. I think the interview is going to be a great tool for people just to share with their friends and family. If you get the opportunity to have a conversation with someone, maybe, share this link. I think it's really good. This is also coming on the heels of our Justice series that we had here at the church, and we do have some resources out there if you're interested in looking into those. That's at cccomaha.org/justice. But I think that does it for us today. I do want to quickly remind you to send in your 3 questions for our upcoming guests in the future. We would love to hear your ideas. I'm sure they're great. But also, you can reach out to us on social media if you have any other questions or concerns. That's at CCC Omaha. You can email us at podcast@cccomaha.org. And until next time, we'll talk to you then.